3 different presentations today. And I'm going to read through all of their bios right now, so then we can move between them. Or actually, because we're doing Q&A at the end of them, I'm not going to do that this time. We'll take them one at a time. We're doing things a little bit differently. So we'll start off today. We have Christopher Irwin, who's a program manager for transactive energy at the Department of Energy Office of Electricity, who manages and oversees just over $1.5 billion in grid modernization projects, leading DOE's smart grid standards and interoperability efforts, working alongside NIST, FERC, and other federal agencies in the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel and other forums. He founded DOE's participation in the federal government's Green Button Data Access Initiative to empower customers with improved access to their own energy data, and is also involved in state and federal regulatory developments and policy aspects of consumer level issues. So with that, I would like to invite Christopher Irwin for your first presentation today.
Great, thank you very much. Just sound check, make sure everything's still working.
Can hear you great.
Beautiful, beautiful. So thank you very much, Commissioner Baratic. This is, the thing that we want to sort of set up here, and that NARUC has been working very hard for over the last year, is that in every situation in our energy context is that information precedes energy. Is that if that information doesn't precede energy, then we run into issues. Someone or another is missing information that they need to make a decision, make a correct action, and move forward with their own plans in the system. And so, what we want to set up here is, in this vehicle grid integration context, is there are new consumers of information, both inside and outside of the utility enterprise. There are new information commodities that we need to make available in order for our society to do coordinated efforts across all these different sectors. So to a certain extent, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about hosting capacity or grid data transparency or interconnection permitting or new service requests or all these things. To a certain extent, we're all getting back to the fact is that if we don't have the information quotients at the beginning, then our likelihood of coordinating our actions goes down precipitously. And I think that the grid data framework efforts that Danielle and others at NARUC have been leading is very exciting for us, because these are difficult conversations to have, and so we have to have some playbooks and some ways of proceeding forward in thorny issues and things like that. We have a couple of participants in the call today who are going to be talking about how much data they think is needed in order to exercise their role in the system or to help others participate in the system. I think since nothing is truly settled, everything is going to be opinion. Nothing is really a proven fact, but I think we can all agree is that the less information that flows among stakeholders who have to cooperate for system success, the less likely we are to achieve our common goals in this front. So that's kind of setting the stage for this discussion. And to let you know that, within the Department of Energy, we have a cross-office collaboration called EVgrid Assist. As many of you very well know, it's as important for us inside of the building to make sure the Office of Electricity is speaking to the Vehicle Technologies Office, is speaking to the Joint Office, CSER, our cybersecurity counterparts. Make sure that we are sharing information so that as we engage with NARUC, NASIO, the external parties of the world, we know what we are doing amongst ourselves, and so we have the most efficient research portfolios and good collaborations moving forward. So I'd like to think that over the last couple of years, you've seen more coordination among program offices, specifically in vehicle grid integration, than you've seen previously. But ultimately, our goal is to improve the caliber and quality of information among external stakeholders, and to, as rapidly as possible, develop new tools, new data sources to make that vibrant discussion propagate outwards without us. In the perfect cases, we won't be helping every single entity, is that they'll be able to help themselves with the tools and the data that's available out there. And we can step back and move into our traditional role in the system. Finally, I just wanted to sort of represent a colleague in here. Paul Spitzen is a gentleman who's working on sort of technical assistance, which is, of course, everybody needs it to a certain extent in order to move forward, and that's no more acute than we would find in the regulatory circles. And so we've, in the same spirit of EV Grid Assist, is we've been looking to sort of coordinate our technical assistance across multiple program offices under IIJA and others. We still have our direct technical assistance to state regulatory commissions, and the Grid Modernization Initiative made 21 awards in December 21 to help some state regulators make some decisions on innovations that are possible in reliability and resilience. We also have an effort that Paul and others are helping to lead with other coordination, with NARUC, with 16 specific state awards and 3 cohort groups looking at equity, forecasting, and interconnection issues. But the final thing that I wanted to leave you with is the fact is that we understand is that when regulators and staff and others are looking for technical assistance, you're not looking for one-dimensional technical assistance. We just want a few more solar panels out there. It is really a distributed energy resources assistance that you're looking for that is as accommodating and improving the DER across the system, whether it's solar panels, distributed storage, community energy projects, electric vehicles, and DC fast charging. So within the Grid Modernization Initiative, we look to continue to offer direct technical assistance and cohort assistance. And so please keep an eye out on the GMLC projects going forward, because we do intend to continue offering technical assistance along those dimensions. With that, I think I'll turn it back to Commissioner Peretick to introduce the next speaker, and I look forward to your questions, beginning, middle, and end.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, appreciate that. And I, as a recipient of some of the DOE's technical assistance in other areas, I can say just how valuable that has been. In Michigan, we actually have a grid integration and distribution system data access technical assistance project that is just wrapping up right now, that we worked with the DOE on, and it has just been a really big help for us to wrap our arms around that problem of how do we really think about transparency about data sharing and how to both be open and accessible while still protecting the privacy of many of the participants in our energy infrastructure. So Chris, I actually just have one question for you, I think, before we move on to our next presentation. Can you think of another industry, maybe of an example that we can look to about someone who has done transparency and data sharing well? Has anyone gone through this in the past, or like what was the who has really done this sort of coordination or data sharing or information transparency while maintaining the privacy and security at the same time? Is there anything from your standpoint at the DOE that we could look to?
I've certainly, it's like you have to, when you ask yourself the question, has any other industry or sector experienced this kind of change? Of course we have, but it's actually difficult to sort of abstract our problems and move them into another application domain. But I don't think any branch of society has gone willingly through the transition. There's always heels being dug in and things like that. I think that when you look at sort of the airline space, is there really was almost it was like only the most manual ways of comparing prices amongst airlines is you had to call them all up, or you had to use an aggregator, aka a travel agent, to help you navigate an information poor environment. So I think the fact that you can go online now and compare flights and paths that are probably 200 different combinations of routing hubs and prices to get you the most information to make a decision about how to get to Poughkeepsie, for goodness sakes. I think that some of those information experiences are what I would use to sort of look outwards into the other industries for. But I'm certainly searching for those myself, because we just want to borrow from the best.
I like that. That's a really interesting example. I don't think I've ever heard the airline industry used as another parallel example to that. But I think you're exactly right that it is a very, it used to be very information poor, and then it very much did open up, and we have a lot more access to that. So that's
and they were not excited about sharing the data. So perfect.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Anybody else? Is there anyone else who wants to chime in, ask Chris any questions before we move to the next presentation? I'm going to pause for a minute here. All right, fantastic. All right, well, thanks, Chris. I appreciate the your time today, and looking forward to our lineup for the rest of the day as well. So next we have Luke Ackerknecht and Phil Stahlfeld from AlphaGrid. Luke is the CEO and co-founder of AlphaGrid. He spent his career at the intersection of machine learning, energy trading, and optimization. Previously, he drove product management at X, the moonshot factory, and built extensive machine learning solutions at Google and Nest. Phil is the CTO and co-founder of AlphaGrid. He's a highly experienced leader and technologist with a passion for using big data and artificial intelligence to solve complex engineering problems. Phil has invented over a dozen patents ranging from facial recognition to power systems mapping technology. And previously, Phil led breakthrough technology initiatives at X, the Moonshot Factory, and Google. Luke, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for the intro. As Catherine mentioned, we're the co-founders of AlphaGrid, and we wanted to speak a little bit to what is the minimum viable data for accelerating EV charging deployment. And our startup is focused on empowering project developers to right size and right site infrastructure before going through the often lengthy interconnection process, so they can maximize revenue, maximize utilization, and also find sites that are good for the grid and also good for business. Next slide, please. And as Catherine mentioned, we met at Google X's Moonshot for the electric grid. We were leading the applied machine learning team and did a whole lot of work mapping distribution and transmission systems. I have an energy background. I built Nest, a forecasting system that optimized all the thermostats for the demand response program. I worked with several utilities at Google X. And also I was a former energy trading consultant, and Phil is the CTO and tech lead. And I'll actually pass the mic to him later for some really interesting insights about how we can use data to enable project development. Next, please. So as you know, hosting capacity maps are not always useful for at least EV charging developers. And we know that developing charging infrastructure is very complicated and expensive due to the difficulty of finding where there's available power, where capacity is, having to munch through many different types of data sets that make the grid just more opaque, and also the slow interconnection process. For instance, on average, in some utility regions, the cycle time from applying for an EV charging station interconnection to development can be over a year. Some of your little background noise. I don't know if anyone can mute. Can you go back one slide? And on the utility side, we need to integrate EV charging stations into integrated resource planning cycles. Yet, especially in California, only about 1/3 of all projects actually get built. And that's just a waste of time and resources and money on the utility end as well. So how might better data transparency, data visibility, and data sharing help these project developers right size and right site charging stations on day zero. If you want to go next. So what is the minimum viable data set? And I'll pass it to Phil, our CTO.
Awesome. Thanks, Luke. Yeah, pleasure to be here. So when we try and think about the minimum viable data, what Luke and I have been sort of seeing for all of these different data sets, and when we hear folks talk about it, is that the graph of the effort you put into the data you're trying to generate versus the value you're getting out of it looks like what you see on the right here, where there's this kind of like sweet spot where it's not a huge amount of effort and you get a huge amount of value out of it. And to try and figure out sort of exactly like where different efforts would fall onto this scale, we can take a look at California's integrated capacity analysis, which is this just behemoth of a project that tries to generate these maximum load and generation capacity values for every line segment, for every month of year, for every hour of day, and for 4 different loading scenarios. And what we found is that's a very, very high effort to generate. It would be very, very far on the right side of this graph. And then the value that they get out of it actually is fairly low based off of the conversations that we've been having with the developers for the EV charging stations and for installing some of these larger batteries on the distribution system. And the issues that we've heard about this is that the data is inaccurate, it's out of date, it's hard to access, and all of those kind of fall out of this idea of it's very, very hard to generate, it's very compute intensive, and then trying to make it available to developers is very, very difficult. In fact, sometimes when we really dig deep into the data and we present it to the developers, they're like, wow, we didn't even know that existed. And so there's this like visibility issue. And then once you get past all of those, what we found is that the data is not directly related to the business goals. And so it's one of these things where you want to try and get into that like sweet spot of, somewhat low or medium effort to generate, but it's giving you a ton more incremental value. Next slide, please. And so just as a couple of examples of things that we've done where you don't need to do these full-on analyses to try and understand this like progression of where different data sets can get you. In this top graph, what we're showing is if you're able to just compute the maximum amount of load capacity that you could add to each line segment on a given feeder, you actually trace out to like a specific point of interconnection. And we're showing how that load capacity decreases as you move out from the substation. And we've thrown 3 different lines on there. And so there's this like red, magenta, and orange line. And what those are actually showing is that we can tell that just based off of how these load capacity values vary, we can see that the utility is actually the points on that feeder where a different type of conductor is used. And it actually shows you all of the impacts that on this specific feeder, the different size conductors will do. And so if you wanted to try and bring more capacity downstream by reconductoring, we could actually give you these estimates without running full power flow simulations of saying, let's go into the sine model and let's extend these out there. We can actually just look at those linear regions and extend them downstream, which we think is this a pretty valuable way of saying, can we at least give you t-shirt sizes for grid upgrades to try and bring more capacity downstream. Now, if you want to go a little bit farther with that, if you have this time variant analysis, so this idea of being able to compute these load values for both the hour of day and month of year, what we show on the second graph, the bottom graph, is if you wanted to try and put in, this is actually a 1.5 megawatt station, EV charging station at a specific location. And what you're seeing with the 3 different troughs on that graph, those are the times of the year when there wouldn't be enough load capacity for that 1.5 megawatt station. And based off of that data, we can say, okay, well, if we look at the size of those troughs, we can say, well, what if you put in a battery of that size to say, oh, I can still offer my 1.5 megawatts 100% of the year without overloading the grid, so you don't actually have to do any of these grid upgrades. And so, we're talking about this peak shaving fundamentally. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so going sort of all the way to this full idea of integrated capacity analysis, what Luke and I did is we looked across the values that are being generated in California, what are being generated in New York and Florida, across the country, as well as what the national labs recommend. And we actually worked with the Michigan Public Services Commission to put together this data requirements doc to say, if you wanted to offer this EV siting tool that we've been building at AlphaGrid, if you wanted to be able to deploy that in the state of Michigan, we put together this full requirements doc. It's linked in the slides, so you can take a look at that. But essentially what we need is a set of geospatial layers that, show us the relationship between substations, feeders, and the lines. And then we also need to understand the capacity layer. So can we say, how much generation, how much load can the different line segments hold? And then we also need the planned system upgrades so that we can understand, if this substation is being overloaded, but you're going to do an upgrade next year, how can we work that in to the math that we would be presenting to the developers that would be using our tool to say, hey, what if I tried to put a 2 megawatt station at this location? And where we're trying to go with this is, we think that AlphaGrid would actually be a really great place to be this data escrow service to maintain privacy and also not have any issues around CEII, where the utility would give their sort of raw data or their computed data to whatever this data escrow service is, possibly AlphaGrid. And what we can do is we can actually build these EV siting tools, or if you want to put in a battery, how does that impact your bottom line? These things where we're combining data from a variety of different sources without actually exposing the raw data that the utility wouldn't want to make public. So this idea of privacy and security and managing the CEII, it's all baked into the approach that we're taking. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I'll hand it back over to Luke to talk a little bit about how we're thinking about the integrated capacity analysis.
Great, thanks, Phil. So, the next question might be, how do utilities actually compute and publish and update this information? And it all really does still get back to the idea of a hosting capacity map. The outputs from hosting capacity analysis do empower these insights. If you use some clever data science to parse the insights from this type of analysis, you can do a whole lot more with it. It seems to me, though, that this analysis is only useful if the data is fresh, right? If these values are relatively recent, the grid is always changing. Every time any object is connected to the grid, it would be amazing if you could update the hosting capacity for generation and load on that feeder, right? With respect to what was just interconnected in real time or daily, or at least weekly, let alone monthly. That would be amazing. It's very rare for most utilities to do this often. And the reason seems to be that it's expensive. It's expensive to do model preparation, and it's expensive to do the simulations. We're data science people. We're really good at software. We don't think that really the simulation bit is difficult. The post-processing bit or the visualization bit is that hard. It's difficult if you use sort of the status quo method for making these maps, which is you usually use SIME on a specific desktop, and then you run this really simple algorithm that says, for every node on the grid, for every loading condition, increase load in gen by a little bit, and continue doing that until it breaks, and then move on to the next node. That's expensive. In computer science, that's like a bunch of nested for loops. It takes a lot of time and money, which is why we've seen in some reports, the California IOUs spend, they quote up to $1 to $5 million a year just maintaining these maps and publishing them at a rate that is still too infrequent to really empower developers to right site and right size infrastructure on day zero. Therefore, increasing the project failure rate and also increasing the interconnection costs and the interconnection time on the utilities in the long run anyway. But if you think about doing this in the cloud, right, with honestly a lot of PowerFlow libraries that the national labs have already published, there's a large opportunity, I think, to sort of disrupt how you publish these maps and make it a lot cheaper and a lot faster. Next slide, please. I think we only have a minute left. Quick case study. We'd also, with this data, you can empower flexible interconnections. So we actually worked with a battery storage developer in California who had a 10 megawatt battery, and they were trying to interconnect to the grid. The utility quoted them by saying they would only let them interconnect if they paid for $1.5 million in extra upgrades, using a combination of both hardware and software to install some battery restriction scheme. We analyzed the utility's own load data, and we found that you could actually avoid about $1.3 million or 84% of those upgrade costs with just software if you were allowed to use a flexible interconnection, a load-only flexible interconnection, meaning instead of sizing your battery to the worst hour of the worst month, August at 2 p.m. of that entire year, if the utility could just tell them when to turn down or turn up the load, turn off or turn down the battery by month hour, right? You would unlock so much spare capacity that's underutilized, and save a lot of cost and effort. And the basic data you need is still that same kind of basic data Phil was talking about earlier. So this is actually more, I think, of like a regulatory or a trust issue. We would need the utility to offer flexible interconnection pilots and offer an agreement, and then build the software to make that happen. But what's interesting is yeah, you can actually solve this problem with just software. You don't need hardware plus software. You can save a lot of money. So that's a way to accelerate EV charging infrastructure deployment. And I think our final slide is the next one. One more, please. And yeah, and better data, right, enables you to also visualize this, make a productized version of a hosting capacity map where you can perhaps search for what you want to build and then get fresh data, and then you'll be able to right size that infrastructure. And that is one of the products that we offer to try to help developers qualify leads and unlock site profitability in one click, so they don't build the wrong thing in the wrong place. Next. And yeah, and we're looking for pilot partnerships. If anyone is interested in either improving the developer portal, the experience of how developers use utility data to size projects, generate hosting capacity maps, or interconnect flexibly for loads, usually charging stations, batteries. We don't want to do generation. Loads are a lot simpler. They're a lot safer for the grid, and they don't require as much data to safely interconnect. So yeah, that's it. I want to be conscious of time. So please let us know if you have any questions.
Thanks, Luke and Phil. Yeah, I think this is fascinating. I'm gonna start off with a question. I actually have a couple of them, but I'm gonna start off with a question, and then I'll open it up to anyone else who wants to chime in and ask a question too, because I think that this is a really innovative and new way of approaching a traditional problem that has been around both for interconnecting loads to the system, but also for the utilities. So as a data science and a software person, as I think you described yourself, do you see these modern methods for data analysis as a solution to like the problems that we have with our interconnection system now? Like how are utilities receptive to this? Like where are the risks in this method of using data and using software for analyzing interconnections?
Yeah, I think it's this idea of doing the flexible interconnections. It's certainly something that we're seeing more traction on. The UK sees a fair bit of it for generation, and there's a pilot in New York with AlphaGrid to try and do that for generation. Load is actually a much simpler case than for generation to do a lot of this analysis. And because unlike solar, these EV charging loads or the battery loads are fully controllable, so you actually have a ton of control over all of them. The way that we're looking at it is it is a little bit of a change where I understand it's scary that it's like software controlling the grid. Like that is very scary. For the case study we looked at with that 10 megawatt battery, what was interesting is the utility was planning this upgrade to use hardware to essentially the sensors that they had would output software. They would then use hardware to interpret it, turn it back into software and a signal that they would send to the battery's energy management system, and it would be sort of software all the way through that system. And so it's really like what you're talking about is like there's one piece that is using hardware that probably doesn't actually really need to. And so we actually think that by doing this, you would have things be a lot more automatic. They'd be a lot more flexible. You could send more regulated controls through the system. And so I think that the places where you would want to focus is, on the cybersecurity of this aspect, where like when we started to bring this idea to the utility, they were like, the issues are not around, do we trust this? Is this thing going to work? It's, is it secure? can we put it into our existing ADMS and DERMS and SCADA systems that are already there? And we're trying to say yes, in fact we can. But I think a lot of this is, we're hearing folks say flexible interconnections, they're the future. That's how we want to do it. What we're trying to do is put together this actual and here's the set of steps that you need to go through to implement it and make it secure and prove it out as a pilot to say, and now we can deploy it in a fully scalable manner. So Luke and I were at a conference with Grid Forward this past weekend, and the way they were planning on using the data was to say, okay, we'll have a fixed schedule and a set of telephone numbers, and when we see somebody in the control room and the substation value goes above this, we'll have them pick up the phone and call the battery and say, hey, can you either turn down your battery or your whatever it is. And it's like, well, okay, that's not scalable. I understand why you're scared about flexible interconnections from that standpoint. But if you introduce more automation where these things are actually, control systems, the same sort of stuff that we trust on, our rockets and airplanes and boats and all of those sorts of things, if we can incorporate them into the electric grid, we need to take that, but fast but safe approach to it. So I know that's a long answer to a fairly short question, but yeah.
No, not at all. I think that's really helpful. What I heard was that asking the right questions about cybersecurity is really important, and that's one of the biggest risks here. It's not necessarily the technology itself or the ability of the software. It's the cyber risk. So as regulators, what sort of questions should we be asking to make sure that the cybersecurity component is sufficient?
Yeah, I mean, I think sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to one more thing. What I think is really empowering about how we've used capacity data that exists is we don't need the raw topology. We don't need the equipment. All that is still secure. We just need to know how much load in gen is available at a point on the grid. And that is a much safer way of sharing data. The utilities can still comply with CEI and cybersecurity regulations. It's just really a matter of making the maps more fresh. And you can unlock all these other things and then getting permission to actually use the data to interconnect in a more clever and software-enabled way. And I think that kind of cracks the nut for at least EV charging and batteries in most places on the grid, without needing to invent, new processes, new data requirements, new methods. Sorry, go for it, Phil.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I was about to actually, for the answer on the cybersecurity side of things, what questions? It's are you doing anything new, right? If you're rolling your own encryption, run away from it. In my opinion, if you say blockchain, you're going down the wrong path. But I think it's one of those where we have all of these amazing cybersecurity features that protect online banking, right? A hacker's dream to take over all of those things. And yet it's remarkably safe, right? And so if you're using things that already exist, they're tried and true, they're proven, they're validated by the open source community and academic institutions. And if you're building on top, standing on the shoulders of giants, I think is what I would say. And so I think it would be, coming back to the what are the industry standards that you're using for your communications protocols, your authentication, your authorization, things that you see in computer science? Are you using the principle of least privilege, right? All of those sorts of just fundamental things that we learn about in our computer security classes when we go through college and university. It's confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility, right? If you get back to all of those and those fundamental concepts, I think it becomes a very nice framework for evaluating the efficacy of one of these solutions.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you. Anybody else? I want to open it up to anybody else on the call if anyone has questions. I don't see any in the chat right now, but if you want to you can either raise your hand or just come off mute and ask the question. If not, I have one last one. What do you, where do you see the biggest barrier to rolling out this technology at a larger scale?
I think it's about the problem of going to one utility and getting a pilot project, demonstrating the efficacy there, and then trying to go to the second utility and having to start from maybe not square zero but square one. I think that's a big problem for us. Well, a potential barrier to the deployment of this. I do think the way that we are trying to approach this is we would like to integrate with the existing software players. We talked to Schneider, we talked to GE about how this would fit into their roadmaps, and we're working very closely with them so that we would focus more on the external developer facing side of things, so that these energy management systems, like the OEMs, the people that are building those, that they're already integrated into the service that we offer. So geographically, it doesn't matter where you would be operating from the developer standpoint. It would from the utility standpoint on, are you using, Schneider ADMS or EcoStruxure DERMS or whatever those things are, and we'd like to plug into those existing pieces of software. And so I think from a technology standpoint, I'm pretty happy with like what that roadmap looks like. But then the question of, can you get folks to trust it, right? So something they've never used before that's actively orchestrating the grid in a way that, they've never seen in their territory. I get why folks would be scared about that. They'd want to see proof points. And so hopefully what we can do is we can, do a pilot project with one utility and then roll that out into like a major strategy for them, and then try and just like build that out. And hopefully it's one of those where, yeah, for the first couple of utilities, we have to move slowly and, start from square one for every single one of them. But hopefully we can get the ball rolling on that, and it grows exponentially faster as we get more folks involved.
And I'll just add, having more utilities publish these maps more often, and yeah, as Phil mentioned, having the permission to flexibly interconnect, finding pilots that actually scale without needing to reinvent the wheel across 3,000 utilities, 200 IOUs. But even then, that's still a small number. It's less than 1 million, so you can, it's trackable. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, thank you. Really appreciate the presentation, and I think this is just fascinating. So appreciate you walking through the technology and the potential benefits that this could provide. We have one last presentation for today, and that is from Carine Dumit, who is the Director of Market Development and Public Policy for EVgo, which is the largest public fast charging network in the US. In her role, Carine engages with regulators, state environmental, energy, and transportation agencies, lawmakers, utilities, industry stakeholders, and NGOs to advance the deployment of public DCFC infrastructure in the Eastern United States. Previously, Carine was Senior Policy Advisor at Tesla and Director of Policy and Markets at Solar City. Carine?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Commissioner Braddock. And then thanks again for the working group for having me today. I wouldn't, if the slides are up, I can just go through them quickly. And then the one thing perhaps that I wanted to share with folks, we could go to slide 2. I'm hoping that through this, first of all, I think this is a great conversation. The fact that we're talking about, I think what Chris alluded at the beginning is really information, and how can that information precede a lot of the work that's being done and really enable a smoother, faster, more cost-effective deployment of that infrastructure on the grid. I think it's very important to keep that in mind. I'm hoping to impart on folks here today 3 key items, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit more about the granularity of a few things. But first of all, I think when we look at the value of making utility data available and how it can actually enable innovative solutions and increase and improve, not just increase, but also improve siting infrastructure. When we look at sort of some of the tools that have been available today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about hosting capacity maps. One thing that I want folks to keep in mind is that that tools does not take away the detailed engineering review and the sort of grid studies that need to happen. What it does is that it provides developers and those involved a better degree of confidence and more certainty at the front end. So you go in kind of knowing the knowns and the unknowns, and you have a better picture as to what you are, what you're dealing with. And at the end of the day, that helps improve the success rates, but also help reduce the fallout rates of these projects. So you are eliminating that surprises down the line, and really improve the decision-making process. The second thing is there's a varying degree among utilities Some of them offer a great deal of details and sophisticated maps so far, and I'll go into some of those examples at the end, and some of them don't have that. And so I think at this stage, and as this transition is occurring, perhaps one of the things that I would impart is that anything is better than nothing. Obviously, you want to aim to be able to provide robust tools that are really helpful and effective, but perfect shouldn't be the enemy of good. So starting with some kind of data and information and hosting capacity maps is a good starting point by which to evolve and progress. And the third thing, at the end of the day, all of this is really enabling a successful transportation electrification, which really means it's really enabling collaboration and partnerships among the utilities and the private sector, the private developers and the EVSPs and all those involved, because it really is an ecosystem. I think it was either Luke or Phil that mentioned that think about it as an ecosystem. So very much kind of thinking along those lines. And, you know, if I could share one anecdote, is that the construction of DC fast charging takes as little as 4 weeks, but all of these processes that you add on to it, whether it is interconnection processes, permitting, all of that can really stretch the timeline where you're looking at an 18 months time frame, right? So what are the different ways, and this is one part of that ecosystem, what are the different ways in which we can really reduce those timelines, but also make those processes more robust. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I'll share maybe a minute about who we are at EVgo, because maybe some folks are not very familiar with what we've been doing, what we're doing in that space. But then I'll maybe dive a bit deeper on some of the hosting capacity map features that we've seen. What are the objectives of those? What are the benefits that one can glean from those, again, from the perspective of a developer? And then give some examples about what would be really ideal to have, what is absolutely needed, and what would be nice to have. And then share some examples, again, just as a way of keeping, you know, having the discussion and maybe sharing some of what we've seen in that space. So next slide, please. Yeah, just really quickly, EVgo is one of the largest public EV fast charging networks in the US. We are across the nation. So we span about 900 plus locations in 60 plus cities across 30 plus states. There's about 140 million people in the US that live within a 10-mile drive from an EVgo station. So we really are proud of a lot of the partnerships that we've done with many stakeholders in this environment, in this ecosystem, and look forward to again helping usher in that next phase of transportation electrification in the US. Next slide, please. This conversation and conversations around how to sort of improve and the energization timelines is really at the core of a lot of the thought leadership that EVgo has been developing and putting out there. And we have created a couple of years ago this initiative called Connect the Watts. I invite you all to check us out on our website, or I'm happy to follow up with some material. But essentially, it's an initiative that really aims to bring in all of those different parts of the ecosystem, whether you're, on the utility side, the site host, equipment automakers, and we do have these frequent conversations about what are those best practices, how can we identify them, and how can we share them. So if that is of interest to anyone, I would love to have the opportunity to follow up with you on it. It's been a great conversation so far, and lots of lessons learned. Next slide, please. So when we think about this initial set of data, or the data that is available through hosting capacity maps or other types of grid integration data, I think one of the things that is important to remember is that these tools, this information, this data has to be informative rather than prescriptive. So it isn't necessarily about saying you shall only deploy or develop here, but it's really about providing a picture at the onset about what does the grid condition at that time look like, and hopefully what does the grid condition, how does the grid condition could evolve over time. And that really helps inform informs the decision-making process on the question of siting. So it's really about, the most helpful is when it is informative. And it's really, the objective really is to ease the prospecting and the evaluation of not only the potential of a specific location, but also the cost of interconnecting. So some of the things that we like to see is data and tools that help us assess available loading capability on grid infrastructure, so for example, transformer, and be able to estimate early on the risk and the cost of that connection to the grid. So being able to rule out circuits, for example, that cannot accommodate DCFC, being able to overlay that data within our own network planning tools, because a lot of, there is certainly a variety of business models in the EV space, but EVgo, for example, we use a proprietary tool that allows us to network plan and develop and seek out opportunities. And so being able to have access to that data early on and be able to overlay it or incorporate it with our network planning models and data helps us really understand and better estimate the benefits and the evaluation process of specific locations. And as I've mentioned, it's really, at the end of the day, integrating EV charging loads more efficiently, quickly, and cost effectively. And when we work, when both the utilities, the regulators, but also and the EVSP developers work on that, and as the data becomes available and as more data becomes available even early on in the process, that really helps us identify and help, essentially the utilities would be helping us identify opportunities and constraints on the grid, because things are not fixed, right? Things evolve over time. So a constrained location may be an opportunity for, or perhaps a utility might be looking to make some improvements at that particular location, that it may not be a great opportunity in the immediate term, but maybe in like the next 3-5 years, that could be an area that could be primed for development. So it's a bit more dynamic than in a fixed thing, and that's something to just keep in mind. So next slide, please. So when we talk about some of the things that we would like to see, the needs to have and the nice to haves. Next slide, please, if you don't mind. So the benefits of having color-coded maps, those can provide initial indication of the loading capacity and the headroom in the circuit. And so what that does, you know, something as simple as green, yellow, or red. So, you know, if you have at least, let's say, 1 megawatts of capacity headroom, you know, you are in the green zone. Something that, you know, anywhere between, let's say, 500 to 1 meg, I'm just making numbers up, 500 kilowatts to 1 megawatts. Those kinds of tools help in initial screening, and they're actually quite user-friendly to use, but it's a good initial screen. Things like transformer, circuit, or substation loads. What's the available load there that we're able to overlay with our maps and or with our tools and be able to get a better sense of that location. You know, voltage level, phase level. So is it a circuit that is it a 3-phase circuit, for example? Can it accommodate higher voltage? What is the amount of power that can be drawn? Is this circuit, can we rule out potential DCFC interconnection? Is it an overhead or is it underground? Because that also matters in the cost. So those kinds of elements we've seen, and those are like important when you look at the kinds of data that we would like to see. Those are things that we think would create a lot of value. Now, as I've mentioned, because things are dynamic, as if we are able to get to a point where there is information being shared about the interconnection queue by a particular substation. I know some utilities or in some jurisdictions, they've done that on the generation side, so on the distributed generation side, but can that be also provided in the context of EV loads or EV charging loads? What kind of system upgrades are the utilities looking at or planning? Is this a location that's perhaps a priority that would be good to know, or it would be good to have some kind of indication? Are there any forecasted investments that the utilities are planning to do that would harden the grid in certain locations? Is there anything within their plan that, as we look into, the 1, 3, 5, whatever year horizon, depends really on the entity, but those kinds of plans are helpful so that we know what is achievable in the short term, the medium term, or in the long term. And I think this is something that both Luke and Chris and Phil had mentioned, is the being able to have that data frequently updated. That's going to ensure accuracy. So it's of much more use if you have data that is provided on a quarterly basis, because things change, right? Rather than doing a refresh once a year. And sometimes I think today, for the most part, those hosting capacity maps are being refreshed about once a year. Now, it's better than nothing, but it would be a lot more helpful if those things become a little bit more integral, a little bit more granular, and more frequently updated. So where have we seen those things? Next slide, please. I want to provide two varied examples. I think the folks mentioned the work that's being done in California. Certainly, this is a long, very dense process, and very technically, very technically dense. But we've seen initial tools being provided in New York and within Con Edison, but also the joint utilities are working on an initiative as well that is a good, that provides a good framework. And also LADWP has also a robust map. Again, these are all tools. It's a long road, but those have been really helpful when we look at the kinds of data, the kinds of visuals, and the kinds of tools that are available to us as we go through our decision-making process. And I think that's all I have. Perhaps, I think next slide is just my contact information if there's anything I can be helpful in following up with. But thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with everyone here.
Thank you. Yeah, really appreciate you running through that. I think there's some good learnings on what you're looking for in terms of the data availability, and some good examples there. So what are some of the primary pushbacks that you see? We've heard some about data privacy and the risks and potential security risks for knowing too much about what is happening on the electrical grid. What do you see those as potential barriers to the data that's needed for your company?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question, and I don't know that and I want to speak perhaps on the maybe give the perspective from the Eastern US. I don't know that that's been necessarily it certainly is a consideration, right? But I think that there has been ways around providing meaningful information and working around all of those details for sure. I think, hosting capacity maps have been there for quite some time in some utilities, perhaps before others, maybe more on the generation side than the load side. It's perhaps a bit, I think, there are these considerations that I think have concrete and fairly straightforward solutions to them. I think the one thing that I would say, perhaps that I wouldn't say a pushback, but perhaps it's a barrier, is that sometimes, and I think things are changing or evolving right now because of where we are in this transition, is the ability and the availability of having dedicated utility staff, right? So where we have seen the most success is that when we have utilities dedicate staff to this new type of load, which is EV charging load, and when we have that kind of dedicated staff that's going to usher in the project, being able to work with us hand in hand from the beginning, being able to share with us that information as we go through the project. I think that helps not just inform the project, but also it also could help inform to a certain extent, maybe even like strategy, right? So I think being able to have, for the utilities to be able to have the support to staff up and get the right, get enough folks to be able to have that intake of applications and be able to shepherd them throughout and be dedicated to them rather than, or maybe a little bit more closely than any other type of load, load integrated customer. I think that would be, I would say that would be very helpful, and that is, I think, a factor that plays quite a big role in the success of the project. I don't know if that answered your question, Commissioner, but I think to the extent that the utilities can have that support to staff up, I think that's an important piece of the pie.
I think that's really interesting. That's a great point that I don't think that we hear very often. So yeah, appreciate that perspective. I'll open it up to the group if there's anybody else who has any questions. I don't see any that are in the chat right now. If anyone wants to just come off mute and ask any questions, you are welcome to do so.
This is Al Freeman, Michigan staff, and I'm kind of curious, what would you recommend is sitting in our seat as regulators of what we could do to better effectuate some better hosting capacity maps? Like what suggestions do you have that we could do to improve the situation?
So was that question for me, just to be?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. I'm sorry.
I mean, I think that as I've mentioned at the beginning, a good starting point, right, is better than just trying to, kind of wanna maybe have the perfect solution. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There are good examples out there of initial starting points. I think that being able to have a discussion with other, and at EVgo we speak we speak frequently with utilities, and I think that to the extent that there could be that facilitated dialogue, so that the initial maybe critical data points that come often, perhaps that are the most important pieces that would be helpful to have upfront, are provided, whether it is in a really nice map or whether it is in some kind of other portal, or whether it is in a stored in somewhere else. There's always a starting point, but I think that being able to take stock of, okay, what's missing right now? What are the key critical pieces of what are the key critical pieces of data that as a developer you need upfront, and sort of start from there, and then maybe leverage some of the existing tools that have been put in place. I mean, I think New York has done a pretty good job at that. It's a good one to start, I think, from the Eastern US, but those certainly have taken some time to develop. So being cognizant of that, but maybe I could give a shout out to a process that is happening in New Jersey, which is really about data sharing and information and streamlining some of that data. Maybe it's a different kind of data, but it's a dialogue happening at the BPU that is really aimed at fostering greater dialogue about what is the information that is needed, what is the problem that is trying to solve, and how can we get there, and how can the data sharing process over time improve so that you get to a point where you have those hosting capacity maps being readily available.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that that perspective. Anybody else want to ask a question before we move to the members only dialogue? Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate all of our presenters today. I want to give you a virtual round of applause now. But at this time, I'd like to switch to just our members only. So that's just the commissioners and